Welcome everybody. I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm speaking on Kaurna land today, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Today we have a very special session. We've got Tein McDonald from the Australian Association of Bushland Regenerators. Tein is a very seasoned Arbor accredited restoration practitioner. She's a teacher, a journal editor for many decades, and she actively works on numerous restoration not-for-profit organisations. She's also the co-author of the National Restoration Standards for the Society of Ecological Restoration in Australia. The National Restoration Standards can be found on SER's Australasia website. We also have Amy Lepeny, who was born in France and came to Australia 6 years ago, and is now working as a business developer for Sunbirds Australia. Sunbirds is a drone service provider for business, government and not-for-profit organisations, and they specialise in environmental monitoring work. Amy's role is to provide a tailored solution to Sunbird customers who need to collect aerial data for their environmental projects. So just a bit of housekeeping before we move on. We'd love to hear your comments and questions throughout the session, and we'll have time at the end for each of the presenters to answer any questions. To submit a comment or question, you need to either be signed into Landcarer or you can type into the comments box underneath the webinar screen. If you're watching in the full screen mode, you'll need to exit to see the comment box. If you have any technical issues, if you're signed into Landcarer, click on the green help button on the bottom left of your screen for live support chat. Or if you're not signed into Landcarer, you can email hi@landcarer.com.au for support. I'd like to thank the Australian Government's National Landcare Program for funding the National Landcare Conference and this webinar series. So I'd now like to invite Tein to come and start her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. And Alexi's going to put my slides up in a tick. But I can let you know that I'm coming from Chile Kuma today. And so that means I'm speaking from Ngarigo country, and I acknowledge Ngarigo elders past, present and emerging. So my topic is about some useful insights that we think the bush regen movement can offer to restoration generally and to the broad restorative challenge. In other words, even where on farms landholders may be interested in just restoring an area to partial nativeness, not full recovery. So next slide. What is the bush regen movement? So bush regeneration really started with the work of Joan and Eileen Bradley, who they were extremely well versed in science and nature, but they would walk every day in Mossman, in their home suburb in Sydney, walk their dog, and they observed that the way that bushland was being managed appeared to be counterproductive. Weed on track edges and entrances to bushland areas was being sprayed indiscriminately, and what was happening was the natives that might actually be replacing that weed in the longer term were being sprayed as well. So they actually started experimenting with methods of weed management that involved being very discriminative in removing weeds and retaining the natives. And it became a method that was adopted by councils throughout Sydney. So, scores of councils have adopted bush regeneration contracting and have their own teams in the Sydney, Greater Sydney area. And this is spread to many urban centres as well. And as well as professional bush regeneration workers, there are many thousands of bush care volunteers working in public open space bushland. Next slide. So all the volunteers and the professional workers all base their work on the fact that natives can in fact retain a surprising potential to recover. This is an intrinsic potential that's adapted. So native plants have evolved over thousands of years and have adapted a capacity to respond to natural disturbances through forming soil seed banks and bud banks and having potential for colonisation. So it's these three methods of recovery that are released when we remove weed in a sensitive way, I guess you'd say, or in an appropriate way. And workers have found that if we can assist that recovery over time, the site progressively improves to a much higher condition. Next slide. So I'm going to show you some slides of some work in Sydney and then some work in rural New South Wales. And these are all photos of sites that I've worked on, so I can vouch for the for the visuals as being reliable. Now, here's a site in Lane Cove in Sydney where a bushland area was affected by runoff from a street, and that's a typical problem in urban bushland where you get runoff running into bushland without any mediation, and it increases the moisture and nutrient load and brings weed with it. Well, it was typical that these sites are often dominated by small leaf privet. So that's what you're seeing in the photo here. A great swathe of small leaf privet, I beg your pardon, dominating this site. And normally a person looking to manage that site in the past would have simply stripped the weed and planted. Next slide will show you that we actually didn't do that. We did strip the weed, but then we used weed debris to create burn piles that could trigger regeneration from the soil seed bank. There was a lot of regeneration that would come up without fire, but some of the typical native species actually did respond better to fire than simply removing weeds. So it became a matter of no longer it being merely focusing on weed, but focusing on how ecosystems and the plants within them actually recover naturally. And we were learning as we went. So the next slide shows you that after a decade or so, the site looked very much like a normal, natural, healthy bushland community. Next slide will show you that it's not necessarily confined to urban bushland or even bushland sites itself. We have found that, yes, while large cleared rural areas don't have the same high regeneration potential that a bushland area would have, there are some sites on farms that can have surprising and important resilience. Next. Now, these next few slides are about sites in northern New South Wales where I was working for a period of time. North Coast New South Wales has high rainfall, and one of the typical waist-high transformer grasses in those rural areas is Soteria. There are many others. They're often imported from Africa and other continents as pasture grasses, but turn out to be not as useful as people would hope because they're highly competitive and end up creating a single stand of species, which is not great for grazing. So this site was actually purchased as a conservation property, and what you see there is a clearing of maybe about 16 hectares that we worked on. And I'll show you some slides of another site before we come back to this site. So the next slide shows a site in the same road, the Gap Road in Woodburn, northern New South Wales, that had been dominated by Soteria. What you see there is sprayed Soteria, and that was indiscriminately sprayed. It was blanket sprayed because there were very few natives in amongst them, and we knew that. This was an area that had been grazed for many decades, and the owners were great nature lovers and wanted to convert it to a conservation property. So the stock was removed, and the weed was sprayed in order to create a better fuel, a more combustible fuel for burning. Now, we didn't know whether it would work. We didn't know whether there'd be natives in the soil seed bank. We didn't know whether we'd have to plant or not. So this was breaking a bit of new ground. And the next slide shows what happened after the first. Now, here's the fire. So it burned quite well. I was a bit too busy actually running the fire to take too many photos of the fire, but next slide will show what happened after the fire. Okay, so we've got quite thick ash bed, and the next slide will show that after a few weeks after rain, we got a carpet of germination, and that was 99% Soteria. So the weed dominated the site. We were somewhat disappointed. We knew there were some natives. We did protect those with paper plates, a few natives, and we actually carpet sprayed the entire area again, completely sprayed it with glyphosate. The next slide shows what happened in the next, within 18 months, we got very, very high cover of natives. Now, we did have to come back on a monthly basis to release those natives from Soteria. And the next slide will show what the site was like about 3 years later. So next, we'll show you that there were many natives that came up on the site. There were about 20 weed species and massive weed, I guess. But it was well represented by natives as well. So 30 native species regenerated on the site and across the site, and 5 of those were tree species that colonised of their own accord. So they blew in perhaps from the surrounding areas. So no planting ended up being needed. And this was a bit of a revelation to all of us, that here was a site in a rural, long grazed area that had more resilience than we thought, than we anticipated. Yes, it took quite a bit of weeding, and that weed management needed to be carried out by people who were skilled in identifying native plants and knowing how to use selective herbicides, and it worked extremely well. So next slide will show the site where the first photo of the Soteria was taken, that exact same area. And we did the same thing. Learning from the previous site, we sprayed the Soteria, and we set out quadrats to find out what would happen on the site. So the site was burned, and you can see on the top right what it looked like just after the burn in 2014 in spring. The bottom left is the following year after multiple sprays of Soteria. Some of the strawy-looking vegetation you see there is dead Soteria, so all green plants in the photo are natives. And the next photo there on the bottom right is the same site in spring 2017, showing the swamp box that had colonised the site. There were quite a lot of different species, including woody species, across the entire site, and no planting was needed. We did put in some casuarina, but it ended up not being needed. So 22 native species, including 3 tree species and 8 weed species, mainly Soteria. So again, a fantastic outcome, and that treatment has now been extended over the whole site. And the site is now too dense with natives to take photos. Yeah, very good canopy now of the swamp box dominant species. So had we planted, we would not have been able to have as great a success as using fire and spot weeding. So next slide. The point here is it's not just about weeding, it's about releasing natives, and it's not about minimising disturbance as the Bradleys first thought, or a lot of us thought. It's about optimising it. It's about matching your treatment to what the plants that you expect to be on site are adapted to through evolutionary timeframes. So some ecosystems are disturbance adapted and they need a degree of disturbance. And in this case, it was essential to trigger that germination. Excessive disturbance obviously would not have that positive result. So if it was burned too often, for example, that may well deplete the soil and the seed in the soil seed bank. So next slide will point to the point that we were finding not only were our patch burns working and not only were our pile burns working, but we studied regeneration after wildfire in degraded areas, and we found that wildfire had the best effect, and that even very, very highly degraded areas responded with native species after wildfire. So that led us to believe that after the black summer bushfires and after sufficient rainfall, we might actually expect some of these highly degraded areas to regenerate, or at least start to regenerate quite well. So the next slide will show what we did at a rural property called Scottsdale at Bredbow, managed by Bush Heritage Australia. Again, this was a very long grazed property, and it had cropping as well on these sites. The sites were dominated by African lovegrass. So in this case, it wasn't Soteria, but another one of the African grass plants that has gone AWOL. A different climate, definitely to northern New South Wales, much lower rainfall and more typical of the central west, I guess, although it's in the coastal division. We anticipated that after the February wildfire, that in the areas that had some native potential, we could actually achieve some very good regeneration results by applying this selective weeding. And we knew that there was a case here where the landholder had aerially sprayed with flupropionate a few winters before, and there was very thick thatch. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the thatch on a neighbouring site. On the site we worked on, it was much thicker than this. There were very few natives visible prior to the fire, and the dead African lovegrass thatch was dominating the ground cover and disallowing regeneration of even African lovegrass. So we anticipated a lot of regeneration of both after the fire. But the next slide will show what it looked like after the fire. Hang on. This slide shows what it looks like after a year of spot spraying. It's a very positive result. We got really, really good natives. There were about 60 native plants, mainly grasses and herbs, forbs, I should call them. Very few shrubs, very little tree regeneration except in the form of suckers. But this is appropriate because it's a grassy woodland. So getting the grasses and forbs back was excellent. And in many cases, in two species were actually threatened species, one of them critically endangered. So that's why it was a high priority site for Bush Heritage, and it was worth putting the effort in. Now the next slide should show, yes, the same slide of just after the wildfire. Now, the magic that happened within the year of treatment actually wasn't magic. It was the result of both the aerial spraying prior to the fire and very detailed spot weeding conducted by volunteers and later contractors. So if the next slide will show the exact same area the 1 year later, but this is in winter, so it shows you the grasses curing off, and it doesn't show the detail that the next slide will show, which is the native forbs. So there would have been about 45 of these species, and I mentioned some of them were threatened. So it was a very exciting project and a site that maybe people might have been tempted to think it needed planting. Turned out to be a site that had very strong regeneration potential. Next slide. So the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators, with whom I worked, conducted a post-fire program where we reached out to landholders, including multiple Landcare groups in New South Wales after the Black Summer bushfires. And we did work with some of these groups, Landcare groups, worked in the Hunter and the South Coast and the Far North Coast. So we found that landholders were understandably concerned about the weeds, and what they were most keen to learn was how to identify the natives. They needed help with identifying natives, so we conducted some seminars, and it was very helpful to be able to share photographs, and we set up a website for identifying native plants at seedling stage. They needed help with effective weeding techniques, and we were able to develop, with assistance from the Foundation for National Parks and Wildlife, 6 videos. We call them FAB videos, First Aid for Burned Bushland videos. And there were a number of sponsors I won't mention, but they're all listed on ARBA's website, where you can go and download for free these, not download, but access these videos, watch them on the web. They're excellent videos talking about not only effective weeding techniques, but also priorities. And the very first of these videos talks about why a bush regen approach can be very helpful after fire. Yes, natives respond very well, but so do weeds. And if you can get to those weeds in that first recovery period, you can tip the balance in the battle in favour of the natives and against the weeds. So rather than spraying or removing weed indiscriminately, the landholders in this case were able to shift their focus to releasing useful natives, and they really did have great results. So that's what makes us think that this model is very useful to Landcare. So next slide. So in terms of priorities, if we take a strategic approach, what we're doing is actually working with natural recovery. So we're working with natural processes. What we're doing is going to the sites that have capacity for regen, because we're seeing that capacity. So we go to the better areas and work outwards. Not necessarily the best areas. They might be able to look after themselves for a while, and certainly not the worst areas, because you're just throwing good money after bad for a while. Go to the areas in between that are at that point where there's a struggle going on between the natives and the weeds, and help the natives. Get it right, Tein. Also, you need to work in a sequential way at a rate dictated by recovery. So that's weeds and natives. So if weeds come back, you've got to go back and work with those weeds to get rid of them, so the natives are favoured. And this will happen. You're probably doing 3 years work in one with a fire, or 10 years work in one. So there is quite a lot of demand to come back. But what's happened is you've flushed out the weed seed bank and the native seed bank. So it's not as gradual as it might be without fire. So go for it, basically. The primary work has been done by the fire, so do as much follow-up as you can. So follow up repeatedly. If you haven't got fire, or you're not using fire, don't bite off too much. Remember that you'll have to come back at least 5 times to the same place over a period of 3 years, probably very more frequently than that, in order to achieve success. Next slide. So, yes, I do maintain that this strategy can be helpful across a rural property, even if there are many areas that don't have regen potential, or you don't see it yet. There are going to be some areas that do have potential, and they're the areas that are perhaps less impacted by grazing, certainly not cropped areas. Cropped areas tend not to have regen potential. So go to the boundaries of a remnant or isolated trees in a paddock, and areas that have any patches of native grass, and see if you can work with the regeneration in that area. So manage the grazing in that area, and see if necessary there may be potential for applying some disturbances, whether that's just a bit of ripping or a bit of burning, but you need fuel for that. So if there are patches of exotic grass, you might want to spray those to add to the fuel for a burn. So if there's any nativeness, I love that word nativeness, that came from Bush Heritage's manager, Phil Palmer. If there's any nativeness, see that as a really good starter, even if it doesn't look like a lot now. It's a sign that there's something going on under the ground. Next slide. Yes, now it's not just fire. Drought also has this same impact. So drought is a disturbance to which many of our native plants are adapted. And when the drought breaks, that's when you get this flush from the soil seed bank of weeds and natives. You'll know yourself when a drought breaks, where did all these weeds come from? Well, they've been stored because they've adapted in their own countries of origin to these sorts of events. So this is when we can take advantage of the ecological opportunity and help the natives at that point too. Next slide. So the recommendation is to try natural regen first, even before facilitating regen. But once you get a feel for it, you can anticipate that maybe you need to intervene a little bit to facilitate that natural regen. So natural regen is where you just simply leave it alone, fence it perhaps, remove the causal factors and expect it might spontaneously recover. But in many cases, that's not going to happen. In many cases, you have to intervene a bit. You might have to do weed control, a bit of applied disturbance. And in some cases, you might want to put in coarse woody debris so that animals are attracted back into the site. If it's a rainforest site, you might plant some pioneers to attract rainforest dispersers, and that can start the recovery processes again. So think of those two things in that order before actually undertaking reintroduction or reinforcement, which is planting or reintroducing seed of the same species but in greater populations, so you're making sure you're representing a wide enough gene pool. So even if you're only going to get grasses and forbs back after your natural or facilitated regen approach, that's still going to be very, very worthwhile. Next slide. In some cases, in fact, this is what a lot of landholders are looking for, the native pasture. And this is a photo of David Marsh from Burrawa, and David and Mary have a property called Allendale, which they've been working on with regenerative agricultural approaches for over a decade, probably two. Now, his goal is to bring back native pastures as well as also managing weed, managing pasture for cattle. So he's gradually, because he's not been adding any fertiliser for decades, he's been seeing fantastic results. The natives are coming back in a lot of areas. And these are natives that, when combined with some of the exotic grasses on his property, can provide year-round and season-round fodder. So this means that the sites are much more resilient to drought, and it's the key to that is appropriate resting. So he's divided his paddocks up into smaller units and moves the stock frequently. So sites have got plenty of rest period. So it's not a set grazing approach here, but a type of cell grazing. So next slide. Now, so the recommendation is think of regen first, but there may be exceptions to this. There may be a need for connectivity between two remnants where there is no nativeness. And in that case, there may be a need to plant or direct seed straight away. And this is obviously needed in some rural areas, and we don't want to take away from that. We simply want to add the option of also using nature's own capacity to recover so that you're getting a better bang for buck, if you like, where it is possible. And in some cases, of course, you're going to need trees and shrubs for farm amenity or carbon plantings. Regeneration can achieve that. In fact, a native biodiversity can sequester more carbon than monocultures. So think of natives for that outcome, but you may need to do some planting if there's no regeneration potential on site. So you'll know that by experience after checking potential in typical candidate sites on your property. Next slide. So the recently published edition 2.2 of the National Restoration Standards actually has a diagram that illustrates that there's a spectrum of approaches between natural regeneration, which is this spontaneous regeneration I referred to, facilitated regeneration. Then in sites with less recovery potential, you may need to combine regen with reintroduction of some species, because particularly in rural areas that have experienced set grazing, some of the more palatable species have been taken out of the system before many of the others. So you do lose some native species as a result of set grazing, and they're the ones that unfortunately you want, because they're the most palatable. So there may need to be some reintroduction there. And of course, if you're looking for a forest or a grassland where there's absolutely none for some strange reason, then you do have to reintroduce the whole lot, holus bolus, and we call that reconstruction. But don't forget, there are fantastic other methods for scalded country, such as water ponding, where you're manipulating the hydrology to achieve regeneration by soil amendments. So it's not a lack of seed in some cases, but soil conditions. So the idea is have a look at the range of conditions in your paddocks and consider using a mosaic of approaches to fit each area's condition. Next slide. So just in summing up, don't rush into planting until you've tested what's hidden in the soil seed bank or can colonise. Especially if you're a newcomer to your region or district, check first and talk with your neighbours to see what condition your sites are in. Very soon after initial clearing, landholders had a hell of a time trying to keep the natives back. And then it was found that the introduced species dominated. But don't be surprised if there's still some residual potential for regeneration. Go to where there are already some natives, even if they're just wisps of natives or something, some acacias or eucalypts. Protect it from grazing. Test some light disturbance if necessary, rest it, and then come back and selectively weed it. But don't indiscriminately spray. Look closely for natives and spot spray or selectively spray. Use a selective herbicide. That'll encourage the natives and you'll have very good results. That will encourage you to do more. Yes, you do have to come back to assist the recovery process, but over a 3-year period, you will find it will have consolidated very well, and that, a little bit often is the best approach. So I think that might be my last slide, and Alexi might just check that, and I'll be saying thank you to you. So thanks for listening, and I hope some of these messages might be relevant to your practice.
Thanks so much, Tein. That was great. Great to see all the before and after photos, and wonderful presentation. I'd now like to introduce Amy Lipney from Sunbirds Aero to present. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks, Landcare Australia, for hosting this webinar. So I'm speaking from Turrbal country today, and I acknowledge the traditional owners past, present, and future. So today I will speak about modern innovation in natural resource management practices, and specifically the use of drones for natural resource monitoring and management. So pretty much knowing what can we do with drones, how does it work, and for which type of applications. So we'll focus on the specific project that Sunbirds Australia and Desert Channel Queensland have been working on for 3 years now, the use of drones to monitor weeds in the Queensland desert. So we'll stick to this use case to demonstrate what problem you can face on some environmental projects and how modern innovation can help. So who is Sunbirds? So Sunbirds is a French and Australian drone company created in 2015, and we are specialized in automated aerial monitoring solutions for environmental projects. So from the deployment of autonomous drones to data analysis, we help government, businesses, non-profit organizations, and landowners, so mostly cattle stations here in Australia, to make better and data-driven decisions. So we work in Australia, but we also have projects in Europe and in Africa. So who is our partner in this project? So Desert Channel Queensland is a community-based natural resource management body that works to ensure a sustainable social, economic, and environmental future for Queensland. So they worked with the community to develop a natural resource management plan protecting Queensland's assets, and that addresses issues identified by the community. So it's one of the 56 natural resource management organizations, and they are in charge of roughly 1/3 of Queensland land. So Sunbirds Australia and Desert Channel Queensland have been working together on a significant environmental project to monitor weeds in the Queensland desert. So pretty much the mission aimed at testing the viability of drones for weed spotting and helping DCQ to develop advanced detection technique for prickly acacia. So prickly acacia, so DCQ started a program, eradication program of prickly acacia in the Queensland desert around 6 years ago now, and Sunbirds joined 3 years ago. So what is prickly acacia? So a prickly acacia is a small tree, generally about 4 to 5 meters high. Sometimes it can go up to 10 meters. So it's not native to Australia. It's actually coming from Africa. And you can also find some of them in Pakistan, India, and Burma. So prickly acacia was first introduced into Queensland in the 1890s. And in 1926, it was recommended by the Department of Agriculture and Stock as a suitable shade tree for sheep and cattle in Western Queensland. So it was then extensively planted around cattle and sheep stations, so for the shade, but also for fodder because of the protein-rich spots. Since that, prickly acacia has since demonstrated capacity to prosper. Now, in the Queensland desert, prickly acacia cover around 20 million hectares. So it's a pretty big spread. And the issue is that stock, and particularly cattle, are the main agents for dispersing prickly acacia. Why? It's because the stock eats the weed, and the seed is then in the gut for up to 6 days. Then the issue is that the stock is moving, and then it increases the potential for long-distance transport because the seed remain viable even after 6 days in the gut. And the issue with this weed is that prickly acacia takes all the water from the ground. So it reduces the cattle access to water and reduces pasture production. And the main issue as well is that it excludes native plants and other animals from water access. So it impacts ecological integrity and biodiversity. And from an economic perspective, it impedes mustering and restricts movement of stock. So to give you a bit of an idea, for the Queensland's grazing industry, it was estimated at 5 million per year in terms of economic impact. So this calculation has been made in 2003, and at that time, prickly acacia was only covering 6.6 million of hectares. So nowadays it's 20 million of hectares, so I can't even imagine how much is the economic impact. And for the cost of control for landowners is around 3 to 4 million annually. So the cost control is considerably outweighing the benefits as using prickly acacia for a shade tree. So in 1957, prickly acacia was declared noxious, and since then, local council, local organizations, landowners, and the Queensland government implemented strategies to reduce the spread of the weed. And to give you examples, so here what you can see is that you have two paddocks. This one, you can see like all the prickly acacias. And this one has been traded to not have any prickly acacias. So the education program started, landowners were pretty careful about it, and you can definitely see the difference in the pasture. So here you have mostly nothing on the ground, while here you have like quite a good amount of pasture for the stock. And that is another example in another region. So it's less visible, but you can still see here some of the prickly acacia, so smaller trees, and you can still see the difference between the two paddocks. But the main thing is that if you want to eradicate weed, and here prickly acacia, it's very important to know where it is, what is the spread, and the density of the trees. So there are different ways of surveying and monitoring natural resources. It really depends on what you want to inspect. If you want to inspect native plants, weeds, native animals, pests, or if you want to inspect landscapes such as forest, lakes, mountain, and the quality of the footage that you may need. So the current methods to assess the extent of an infestation are three. So the first one is called bioclim. So the first assessment to determine the potential distribution and the spread of prickly acacia is done by using bioclim. So what bioclim is doing, it's establishing a climate profile for prickly acacia in India. So pretty much knowing at which time of the year prickly acacia are growing, and which temperature was at that time, and what are the rainfall value. Then they use those value and put it into Australian's climate environment. And then they can match these data and know what could be the potential distribution of prickly acacia in Australia. Currently, modeling indicates that up to 70% of Australia's mainland is at risk of prickly acacia invasion. So it's very, very important to treat it now. So, but all of that, bioclim is really great, but it gives potential distribution. So it does not give you the actual amount of prickly acacia in Australia. So another way to be able to monitor and inspect weeds is satellites. Satellites are a great way to get information on very, very large area. So for prickly acacia, as I just told, it's 20 million hectares. So satellites are really good. The only issue with that is sometimes, and most of the time, the resolution is too low to check most natural resources. So it's not exactly useful data if you're checking on like small trees and if you're checking on pests, for example. So what is the other solution that a lot of natural resource management groups are using right now is manned aircraft. So in order to obtain visual information to survey or monitor natural resource, they use either helicopters or planes. They're really great because they give a really good level of information that you can hardly get through satellites. And they're often used to collect information on very, very large area with very good resolution. So either you can just see what's happening in the ground, or you can have cameras on helicopters or manned aircraft. However, they are very, very costly to operate and to rent. And that is an issue that is faced by a lot of natural resource management groups or Landcare groups. They often do not have the skill in-house to rent by themselves, to use by themselves these machines. So they have to rent the service, and it's often out of the budget. Plus, it's quite polluting and is quite unsafe to operate. And so that's where drones are coming. So that's where the use of drones have been growing in the past years, because it can give the same level of information than manned aircraft, but at low cost, with less skills required and safer way. So that is an example of imagery you can get from satellites. So the resolution is way too low, so you can't really get precise information. So drones are leading edge solution for any inspection, mapping, and surveying mission. So here you can see one of our drones. So they are a very amazing tool to help getting information that satellite can't get, or that helicopters are too expensive to run to get those information. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with drones, but you have different types of drones. You have the small one, the multi-rotor, and I'm pretty sure everyone's seen those ones. But you also have fixed wing drones, you also have vertical takeoff and landing, and many others. The main difference between them is the flight time and the resolution you can get. So for Sunbirds, we are using fixed wing drones as the one you can see. They're really useful for large-scale monitoring and inspecting the flora or getting footage of large part of land. So here's an example. So here you have a multi-rotor one, so a small one. They're used for spraying, for example, or inspecting small parts of land. And you have fixed wing drones. So this one is one of the Sunbirds drone. This one is particular because we have solar panels on top. So it's using solar energy to fly. So what are drones useful for? The main added value for drone is that you're able to obtain large variety of data from very large or inaccessible territories. It's also a way cheaper way to inspect natural resources than using helicopters or planes. Not to mention that it's way safer as well. Also, a good thing as well is that you can actually learn to fly a drone, and it's fairly easy and not expensive. So more and more Landcare groups are now using drones to inspect by themselves when they need the natural resources that they are managing. So that is an example of photos you can get. So the resolution is pretty good. You can inspect and you can count the number of trees that you have. You can inspect what type of species it is. So that is an example of a weed inspection that we've done with DCQ last year or 2 years ago. That is on, it's a bit different, but the same as a photo that you can use. So you can inspect animals. So this one, we've taken this one on landholders station. So cattle station, so you can inspect cattle and sheep station, sorry. So you can inspect also animals. What else you can see on the drone? So just like classical photos, as I just shown you, but you can also change the camera and you can have a different level of information if you need to. So you can have thermal imagery, which is really, really good if you're looking for pest animals at night. You can also have NDVI, so this one is used for checking plants' health. So it gives you the water stress level of plants. You can also use drone to check elevation of landscape, for example, as well. Okay, so what are the applications? There are many, many applications in using drones for natural resource management. Drone can be very useful, for example, for pest animal control program. It can help you spot feral animal in an area, so either by day or by night. It can help you count animals or monitor any shooting program. So it's really good for dingo, cannons, feral pigs, crocodiles. It can also be used, so in that example, for weed detection and identification programs. So with Desert Channel Queensland, we've been mapping more than 7,000 hectares of land and generating hundreds of photos. So what has been done is that the photos has been used in an artificial model. So DCQ developed their own artificial model. And in that image, what you can see is like all the trees have like a different color, and you can also see a different number on the trees. So what the artificial model doing is identifying if the tree is a prickly acacia, and if it is a prickly acacia, what is the size of the tree? And that is very, very important to know for DCQ, because by knowing where the weed is and the size of the tree, then they can quantify the pesticide needed to kill those trees. So on a small parcel, it's not really useful. On 20 million hectares, it's very, very useful. So if you combine drones and artificial intelligence, you can pretty much measure anything. Obviously, what you can do for weed, you can also do that for native plants. You can also use drones for assets and land management in general. So this photo specifically has been taken also by one of our drones in the Queensland deserts. We've been doing some imagery and flights after the big floods that they had, because we wanted to inspect the erosion phenomena. So drones are useful for erosion control, drought, floods, bushfire as well. So that obviously has not been taken in Australia, but we have been using drones as well as with forestry management groups. So this photo has been taken in Congo in Africa by one of our drones. It's been used to check the different species of the forest. So we've been flying above the canopy, and the photo are not used to check what are the different species in that forest. Okay, so what is the impact of getting this type of information? Why would you need to get information from a drone? What is the idea behind that? The main added value when you work with a Landcare group, even if you have quite a decent sized property, is that you can obtain data from large or remote or inaccessible areas. So imagery that you couldn't have access before. With this information, you can plan and you can make data-driven decisions because you know what's happening, when it's happening, and where it's happening. You can improve your current programs, or you can implement larger scale program, and you can adapt land management practices. It's also a great way with this data to be able to better budget and target if you are working for a Landcare group. And the best thing as well is actually with drone, you can improve visibility over time. So you can check what are the impacts of what you're doing on the weed or any other activities that you're doing. So it's really enabling communities and nature activities to better address long-term strategic issues of national importance. So in a case to go back, and that's going to be my last slide, but to go back to what happened with DCQ. So we started working with them pretty much just here. So 2017, somewhere there. So thanks to the aerial imagery they got, they were able to know where the weed was, the spread, and the size of the trees. So they were also able to assess how fast the spread was going over time. So by knowing this information, they were able to adapt their eradication program. Because they were knowing where it was and the size of the trees, they were knowing which quantity of pesticide they were needed, what team was needed to go there, which vehicle, anything like that. So they were able to reduce a lot on the operational cost and obviously adapting also the method of eradication. Because you can eradicate prickly acacia with chemical, fire, or mechanical ways. So you can see that since they started implementing drones, they've been very more efficient in their program in eradicating prickly acacia. So if I'm not mistaken, I think they are now the premier weed control organization across 1/3 of Queensland. So that's it for me today. Hope was able to give useful information on drones.
Thanks so much, Amy. That was very impressive. Being able to identify species from the air. My word. Well, look, that concludes the formal part of the presentations. We do have a few questions that have come through. I believe this one will be for you, Tein. Our property called Allendale is in Blackheath in the Blue Mountains. All our bushland was burnt on December 2019, including a totally degraded area, which had been degraded with Pinus radiata, blackberry, privet, holly, etc. for 50 plus years. When it all burnt, we got in and cut down and hand-treated the re-emerging weeds. We were encouraged to plant native pioneer plants, but since then, and following good rainfall, there has been prolific regeneration of those plants, and trees are thriving better than the planted trees. Perhaps we should have waited and just continued to treat the weeds.
Yeah, look, your experience there will help you to recommend to your neighbours and others if it ever happens again. Let's hope it doesn't. That you don't need to plant straight away. Give it a go with the weeding and see what comes up, and that will let you know which species you need to plant and where they're needed. So it'll give you a much clearer idea. Even when you're planting, you still have to weed, so it's never going to be wasted work. In the Blue Mountains, as with much of Eastern Australia, ecosystems are open ecosystems, so the idea of planting to suppress weed doesn't really work as well as it might in, say, rainforest. So look, fire reveals an enormous resilience that we don't expect. And as someone said at another seminar yesterday, we often see fire because it is so destructive to humans and fauna as being catastrophically destructive to plants, and it's not always the case in fire-adapted communities. It is destructive to rainforest species, and there's been some big impacts there. But work with it, and you'll be rewarded.
Thanks, Tein. There was also a question about where is a good place to get information on weed control techniques.
Right. Well, the website resources that ARBA has, Australian Association of Bush Regenerators, arba.org.au, is they're very, very good resources, but there's no substitute for asking someone who knows, and that may be your Landcare coordinator or facilitator. Let's hope that they do have experience in native plants. Many of them do. Many of those Landcare coordinators and facilitators are some of the best, the most knowledgeable people around, and that's what I'm sure Landcare is looking for in those people. But also you can enrol in courses in conservation and land management. And after the bushfire, there was an opportunity offered by TAFE for online training. They offer only a subset of conservation and land management modules. So they only offer a little short course, which is provides a statement of attainment. But many landholders are not looking for a qualification. They're more looking for the knowledge. So keep your eye out and make inquiries about potential online courses through your RTO. Now, online is not always easy, but you do have access to teachers who can then look at your photographs and so on. So you can send also photographs to a website that ARBA's set up called Plant Identification. So have a look at the ARBA website and they will let you know. You can also use the Atlas of Living Australia has iNaturalist, and you can send specimens there. Oh, and one of the best is a Facebook group called New South Wales Plant Identification for New South Wales people, and there's Australian Plant Identification as well.
That's great, Tein. Thank you. Now, Amy, this is a question for you. With those, when you showed that image of the rainforest in Africa where all the plants had different heat signatures, so you can identify, have all those species been catalogued on the ground and you have the botanical name for each of those different signatures, or is that still a work in progress?
So it's not a work in progress anymore. So it's actually using artificial intelligence to identify the species. So what has been done is that first you match. So what you do is you match the information that people get on the ground, knowing in this specific space there's that trees, and we know what species it is. And then you match that with the imagery that you collected through the drones. Once you do that a couple of times, then the artificial intelligence model will know which species is what, and we're able to recognize. So it's not 100% sure technology, but it's 90 to 95% sure. The artificial intelligence model is able to detect exactly which species it is just from the canopy.
Wow, that is incredible. Look, that concludes the session and the questions. So, look, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Tein and Amy and also everyone who attended online. We'll be circulating an email later this afternoon with a link to the recording. So feel free to share this with your networks. It's a very informative session. And also keep an eye out for Landcare Australia's social channels and newsletters for more information on the National Landcare Conference. So thanks once again, Tein and Amy. Great sessions.
It's my pleasure, James. Thank you.